Welcome to the Education Insights Focus on Behavior podcast. We're here to talk about all things behavior in the world of education. We take the science of behavior and break it down for educators into easily implementable steps, and we're excited to spend some time with you. Get ready to talk through behavior, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can all improve our work in schools so we as educators can be more fulfilled and our students can be more successful.
Welcome back to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. I'm your host, Dr. Selena Layden, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Daniel Irwin. Hey, Daniel.
Hello.
And Dr. Daria Lorio-Barston. Hi, Daria.
Hi, everyone.
As always, we are so happy to have with us our producer, Emily Muse. Hi, Emily.
Hello there.
All right. Well, if you've been following us for a while, this is not new, but just in case, this is actually one of our special episodes of our podcast where we're going to take a deep dive into the 7 dimensions of behavior. So in 1968, there was an article published in the very first issue of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. That article is called Some Current Dimensions of Applied Behavior Analysis, and it's really a seminal article in our field. And it discusses these 7 dimensions, and these dimensions are really what are required in order for something to be considered behavior analytic. And so just a reminder that these dimensions are applied, behavioral, analytic, technological, conceptual systems, affective, and generality. And really, these are useful to help inform the science of behavior that we focus on. And so today, we're going to specifically focus on the dimension of affective. And if you are interested, the article will be linked in the show notes. It's pretty freely available to access, so I encourage you to take a look at it. But in the article, they talk about what affective is, and not surprisingly, it's actually what it sounds like is the intervention that you are implementing making a difference. And to quote the article, it says, if the application of behavioral techniques does not produce a large enough effect for practical value, then the application has failed. So I'm going to open it up to Daria and Daniel and talk about what does effective mean in our practice and why is that important to us?
So I'll go ahead and jump in. The part that I love about this dimension is that it really talks about that practical importance, right? And the article brings up really good point about that it's important for us to make sure that we're looking at the behavior change that is enough to be socially important. So a lot of time in other branches of sciences, we can see really valuable studies that talk about small but very reliable shifts and changes. And while they should be celebrated, in our field, that's not quite what effective means, right? Effective gets to that point of, practically speaking, is the new behavior or is the behavioral shift, is it socially enough important? And I believe that the article gives an example of improving student scores from a D minus to a D may be statistically significant, but it's not going to be considered socially important in our life. And so I think about when we're shifting behaviors, and I think about, is the end result, is it actually of practical value? Or is it something that we did and some behavior shifted and that's lovely, but it's not enough to be considered effective by this definition?
I agree. And I think, well, I agree because it's in the article, but I think that meaningful change leads into a couple of other things. And one is, does that change in the student's behavior impact the way they live, impact their availability to access reinforcers across a range of environments and, those kinds of things. But it's also that social piece, that social significance of if we're supporting in a classroom and we are helping a student develop a new skill or reduce challenging or interfering behavior, but that's not necessarily a priority in that environment or to the people who are implementing that intervention, then we may be making that change, but it's not making a change that's going to be as meaningful or an intervention that might not carry on with fidelity because it's not creating the change that's meaningful to the people who are implementing the intervention.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, for example, I worked with a student one time who was screaming in excess of 500 times a day, right? So, to the point of we weren't actually able to accurately collect data because the screaming was so frequent. We put some interventions in place and we got that down pretty quickly to about 40 to 50 times per day, which is a huge change in behavior. But had we just said, well, we changed the behavior, we stopped here, I don't know that I would argue that that's an effective intervention, right? Still 40 to 50 times a day of screaming is a lot. It's still causing a lot of interruption and disruption in that environment, and it's still not allowing that student to be able to access what they need to in their education. Thankfully, we continued the intervention and we had to put some other things in place to get it down to that near zero level. But I do think sometimes, even though we can see a huge shift in behavior, it may really not be as effective as we were hoping it would be. The other piece of this is I think sometimes we know behavior change takes time and we need to allow it to take time. But if we have interventions going on for really long periods of time, like if it's going on for years and we're not really seeing the changes that we would hope that we would be seeing, we really do need to evaluate how effective we're being.
Well, and Selena, your example makes me think about when we are really well intentioned and gather data. And then when we look at data just as numbers, right? And I was thinking, if you had even in a week gone from 400 screams to 300 screams, like that would on paper would look pretty incredible, right? Or even if you had a downward trend where you went from 400 to 350 to 300 to 250, right? Like that would paint a picture that what we're doing appears to be moving in the right direction. But if we are still having a student whose behavior is interfering with their learning and with learning of others, then I think that's where that practical aspect of is this effective comes into play. And then the answer may look very differently than when just our data trackers would potentially indicate. And to that point, one thing that I really love about this is y'all know me enough to know that I do love me some qualitative research, right? And I'm all about stories and people and their perceptions and lived experiences. And so what I really love that even in this article, we talk about that the answer to the question of is this practically important? Is this socially important? Really lies with the people who are dealing with the behavior. So whether we're talking about students or folks who are working with students or whoever it is and whatever behavior we're talking about it, I think this is a beautiful moment when we have absolutely data coming into play with also voices and perceptions and talk about in a practical manner, right? Like, well, what does that actually mean? And is that actually moving the needle in terms of our day-to-day life? And I think that's a really important piece because I think sometimes we all do love our data trackers and our data stickers and all sorts of data collection tools. But I think this is the piece that helps us look at it as a whole picture when we talk about that dimension. And so I thought that was an important point to bring up as to making sure we're listening to the people who are actually being affected by the behavior.
I think that can go both ways too. So in thinking about like the data collection and being able to point to whether it's having an effect on the behavior we're trying to change, that even sometimes those changes that may not practically have an impact in the moment, right? 500 screams a day to 400 screams a day, being able to measure that and sort of set goals around that and have that objective measure can really point people to the fact that yes, we are making progress. It's not where we want it to be yet. And so we're building in sort of decision-making points to say, okay, are we seeing the same trend? Are we still moving in the right direction? Asking and answering those questions about like, what about this is effective or what seems to be working, what seems to be superfluous or whatever. And then being able to communicate that with team members and the people who are impacted by these behaviors, whether it's parents, whether it's, whoever, in a way that one celebrates some of that success and provides those checkpoints so people feel not like they're spinning their wheels, that from a practical standpoint, it feels the same. 500 to 400 pretty much feels the same, but it gives you the opportunity to sort of say, yep, we're trending, we're moving, let's keep going. And so I think from a motivation standpoint and from a not feeling like what you're doing is working a little bit, it can be kind of reinvigorating, it provides sort of a second wind for, okay, keep going. We're doing it. We're moving along as a team. We're making progress. I think the other part of that is it's easy for, or I wouldn't say it's easy. There's a lot of moving the goalposts, right? And so, yeah, we're down to 400, but I wanted this to be at 0. Well, our goal was to get it down to 300. So when we start looking at the data and we start looking, is this making an impact on the student behavior? When we set those goals and set benchmarks, it helps to keep us in line. It helps us stay focused on shorter term outcomes that may not be the end result, and we know that, but it keeps people from kind of moving the goalposts. Well, he was screaming and hitting, right? So all kinds of things can get conflated, and I think just being really specific in what it is we're looking for and what we're measuring can help maintain the focus and provide some affirmation, even if it's not all the change we want to see all at once.
And Daniel, I think to that point, you hit it on the nose, right? When you say about we've got to figure out what behavior is that we are trying to shift. And so to me, this is kind of a both kind of situation. I agree with you as far as making sure that we're talking about what does effectiveness look like and looking and monitoring and looking at the data trends and all those pieces. I certainly wasn't trying to insinuate that like, oh, throw the data out the window, right? Um, I think it's also important for us to think about when we start with interventions to make sure that what we're designing from the start is something that we believe to be effective. It's something that we are really looking at to the needs of the student and the environment to make sure that the behavior that we are trying to shift is actually practically important, right? And I think sometimes we fall into the traps as because we're human, right? As all good people do, I would imagine, in that we sometimes conflate what's something that's just a nuisance for us and what is a socially significant behavior. And I think sometimes we write plans or we write goals around behavior that, yes, it might get under my skin and it would make my life easier if we got rid of that behavior or brought it down to like something small. But in a great big scheme of things, it might not be socially important at all. And the illustration to this, I remember working with a delightful teacher who could not handle students clicking the pens in her class. And so she really very strongly felt that that should be a goal because the student clicked the pen a lot, and that that should be a goal in a student's plan to reduce the number of clicks. And while I understand that that is something that could really frustrate someone if that is something that bothers you, I also don't know that that behavior would be considered socially important per se, right? And so I think with this dimension, I think we got to think about designing from the very front, from the very beginning, as to is what we're trying to do, is that how are we going to define that effective piece? And then I think as we're measuring, those are certainly the conversations that we return to.
And I think this is where those indirect assessment pieces from the FBA process really, if we design those correctly, we can really kind of get at some of that information and understanding these are a priority for you. They may not be a priority in this other class or for the parents or for the student. And it gives us that kind of personal input that's maybe less objective, but gives us that idea of sort of what is important to the teacher so that or whoever will be implementing so that we can really design those interventions either to address those things or to tie them in or, kind of find that middle ground and find, what's going to work for them.
So really, what I'm hearing you say is that as people are trying to shape behavior, they gotta have us like living in their pockets or our voices somewhere in their shoulders and asking them to look at the data, make sure that we're using data-informed decision making, and also while looking at the data, to also ask the question, is this intervention effective, right? Is it what is the practical importance? What's that? So what now what about it?
Yeah, and I think the bow on this is I think this is also why it's really important as a team to be checking in with each other pretty consistently, making sure that, if we have an FBA in place, if we have a behavior plan in place, we're not saying, well, we'll meet, at the end of the school year or when the IP is due and see how it's going. But rather say, well, what makes sense for how long it should be before we meet to talk about this? And in the meantime, how are we communicating with each other to say, yep, things are going great and this is working really well and it's effective? Or, hey, this isn't working the way we thought it was going to. And we may need to switch gears a little bit. So, all right.
Selena, I think that's a great way of thinking about operationally defining what effective means for a whole team of people, right? Because what my practical importance maybe may not look the same for you or Daniel or Emily.
Exactly, but it still allows you to have those conversations and make sure that because the other piece is when you're not the person who's in the room all the time with that person, um, what you may think is a good amount of time may be too long or too short for others on the team. So, all right. Well, I think that actually ties up this conversation pretty well. Daria, Daniel, pleasure as always.
The pleasure is
Always.
mine.
Emily, thank you for always keeping us on track.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, we will see you on our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can join the conversation by emailing us at cbis@odu.edu, visiting www.cbisva.org, or following us on Facebook, Instagram, X, or Blue Sky at CBISVA. Special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for their support of this project.